You really think that rag belongs on a military base? The lieutenant's voice cut through the dry afternoon air, sharp enough to turn heads, and a few young soldiers nearby chuckled under their breath as Arthur Hayes stood still at the edge of the tarmac, his old jacket hanging loose on his shoulders, faded olive fabric worn thin by decades of sun and wind, the cuffs frayed, one sleeve slightly shorter as if time itself had taken a piece of it. But he didn't react, not to the laughter, not to the smirk inches from his face, his pale eyes steady, fixed somewhere beyond the line of parked vehicles shimmering in the heat haze. As if he were listening to something no one else could hear, the lieutenant stepped closer, boots crunching against the gravel, reaching out with 2 fingers to tug lightly at the collar. "This isn't a museum, sir. You can't just walk in here dressed like that." More laughter followed, louder this time, encouraged by the ease of the moment, by the assumption that this quiet old man didn't belong, that he was just another civilian who had wandered too far past the wrong gate. But Arthur didn't step back, didn't explain, didn't defend himself. He simply adjusted his stance, the wind catching the loose edge of his jacket, revealing for a split second the inside lining. Something about it different, too precise, too deliberate. But the lieutenant didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying the attention. "You got ID? Or is that jacket your credential?" he added, voice dripping with casual authority. A couple of the younger troops shifted, watching, unsure now, because there was something off about the stillness of the old man, something that didn't match the situation, didn't match the mockery. One of them glanced at the stitching along the inner seam, brow furrowing, but said nothing. The air seemed to tighten just slightly, like a breath being held. Arthur's hand moved slowly, not defensive, just resting against the side of the jacket as if it belonged exactly where it was, as if it had earned its place there long before anyone standing in front of him had even put on a uniform. The lieutenant gave a short laugh, louder now, pushing just a little further. "I'm going to need you to step away from the restricted area," he said, but the words landed differently this time, less certain, as if even he could feel it, that faint shift in the atmosphere, like something unseen had entered the space between them. The wind died for a second, the distant hum of engines seemed to fade, and somewhere across the base, far from the laughter and the gravel and the worn jacket, a phone began to ring, and a name was about to be spoken that would change everything. The laughter did not return, not fully. It lingered in fragments, uncertain now, as if the air itself had shifted in a way no one could quite explain. Lieutenant Brandon Cole straightened slightly, his smirk still there but thinner, less certain, his eyes narrowing as he studied the old man in front of him, trying to find something ordinary to hold on to, something that made sense. But Arthur Hayes gave him nothing, no reaction, no apology, not even annoyance, just that same steady gaze that seemed to pass through him instead of stopping at him, and it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "You are not hearing me," Cole said, voice firmer now, reaching for authority like a lifeline. "This is a restricted zone, and I am giving you a direct order." But the words did not carry the same weight they had a moment ago. They felt lighter, almost hollow, as if something larger had quietly stepped into the space and taken priority. A few yards away, Sergeant Daniel Brooks had not moved. Since the jacket shifted, his eyes fixed on that inner seam. The stitching too clean, too deliberate, not the kind of repair done at home or in a local shop. It was precise, measured, almost surgical, and beneath it, barely visible when the wind lifted the fabric again, was a faint marking, not printed, not embroidered, but worked into the material itself. A symbol he could not fully see but somehow recognized in the back of his mind, the kind of recognition that does not come from memory but from instinct, from stories heard in quiet rooms where names are spoken carefully. Brooks swallowed, his hand drifting slowly toward the radio clipped to his vest, hesitating for a fraction of a second as training and intuition collided. Then he turned slightly away from the group, shielding the motion, and pressed the transmit button, his voice low, controlled. "Command, this is Brooks at Sector Charlie. I need a quick verification on a name." There was a brief pause, static crackling softly. Then a response, routine, unbothered, asking for clarification. Brooks glanced back at the old man, at the jacket, at the stillness that no longer felt passive but intentional, and he spoke the name carefully, as if saying it too loudly might carry consequences he did not yet understand. Arthur Hayes. The line went quiet for a second longer than expected. Not static, not interference, just silence. And Brooks felt a cold line of tension run across his shoulders. On the other end, far from the tarmac, inside a climate-controlled office where decisions moved faster than people realized, a phone was lifted, a second line engaged, and somewhere above rank and routine, a colonel heard the name and did not respond right away, his hand resting on the desk, fingers tightening slightly, as if something long buried had just been placed in front of him without warning. Back on the tarmac, Cole exhaled sharply, impatience creeping back in, mistaking the silence for hesitation. "Last chance, sir," he said, stepping forward again. But even as he spoke, the distant sound of approaching boots began to rise, faint at first, then clearer, deliberate, cutting through the lingering heat and the uncertain quiet. And for the first time since the laughter started, no one said a word. The sound of boots grew louder, measured and fast, not the casual stride of soldiers passing through, but something more focused, more urgent, and it cut clean through the stillness that had settled over the tarmac. Lieutenant Cole turned his head instinctively, irritation flashing across his face as the interruption broke the moment he thought he still controlled. But the expression faded almost immediately when he saw who was approaching. Not one, not two, but a small group moving with purpose. Uniforms crisp, posture rigid, and at the center of them a figure that did not need introduction, Colonel Richard. Vance did not slow as he stepped onto the gravel, his presence carrying a weight that pressed down on the space before he even spoke. Conversations that had been murmuring at the edges died instantly. Boots shifted, back straightened, and for a brief second the entire scene reset itself around him. Cole snapped to attention without thinking, the reflex automatic, drilled into muscle memory. "Sir," he began. But the colonel did not look at him. Not yet. His eyes had already found Arthur Hayes. And something in that gaze was different. Not confusion, not curiosity, but recognition, immediate and absolute, like a name that had never left his memory even after years of silence. The wind moved lightly across the tarmac, lifting the edge of the old jacket again, and the colonel's eyes dropped to it for a fraction of a second, focusing on the stitching, the inner seam, the detail that no one else had understood, and his jaw tightened ever so slightly, as if confirming something he had already known before arriving. Sergeant Brooks took a small step back, instinct telling him he had crossed into something far beyond his rank, the radio still warm in his hand, while Cole stood frozen in place, waiting for acknowledgement that did not come. The colonel closed the remaining distance slowly now, each step deliberate, the gravel crunching underfoot the only sound anyone dared make. And when he stopped in front of Arthur Hayes, the silence became complete. No engines, no distant voices, nothing but the faint movement of air across fabric. For a moment neither man spoke. Arthur remained exactly as he had been, still, composed, his eyes steady, while the colonel studied him, not as an officer assessing a situation, but as a man confronting something deeply personal, something tied to a past that did not belong in official records. Cole swallowed, the tension building in his chest, unsure whether to speak again or remain silent, every instinct telling him he had made a mistake he did not yet understand. And then, without raising his voice, without turning his head, Colonel Vance finally spoke, his tone low, controlled, but carrying an authority that reached every ear on the tarmac. "Lieutenant," he said, and Cole responded immediately, "Sir." The word tight in his throat, "Step back." The command was simple, but it landed with a finality that left no room for interpretation. Cole hesitated for half a second, just enough to feel the weight of it, then took a step back, boots scraping lightly against the gravel. The distance between him and the old man suddenly feeling far greater than a few feet. The colonel did not acknowledge the movement, his focus never leaving Arthur Hayes. And then something shifted, subtle but unmistakable. His posture straightened further, his shoulders squared, and slowly, with deliberate precision, he reached out and adjusted the edge of the worn jacket, smoothing the fabric with a care that no one present could comprehend, before stepping back himself, bringing his hand up in a sharp, controlled motion, and saluting. The gesture held firm in the still air, and in that moment, no one laughed, no one spoke. and no one moved. The salute did not drop, not immediately. It held in the air like something carved in place. And that was when the weight of it truly settled over everyone watching. Because this was not routine. This was not ceremony. This was something else entirely. Something that did not belong to schedules or protocols. Lieutenant Cole felt it first in his chest. A tightening that made it harder to breathe as his mind raced to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. A colonel standing at full attention. Before a man he had just dismissed. A man he had nearly ordered off the base. And the realization came slowly, painfully, that whatever line he thought he understood had already been crossed long before he opened his mouth. Arthur Hayes did not return the salute right away, his gaze steady, measuring, as if confirming something of his own. Then, with a movement just as controlled, just as deliberate, he raised his hand and returned it, not sharp, not exaggerated, but exact, the kind of motion that comes from repetition over years that no longer need to be counted. And when their hands lowered, the silence deepened rather than broke. Colonel Vance exhaled slowly, the tension in his jaw easing just enough to speak. "It has been a long time, sir." The word carried weight, unmistakable, not a courtesy, not a habit, but respect, direct and intentional. A ripple moved through the small group of soldiers standing nearby, subtle but undeniable, back straightening further, eyes shifting, trying to reconcile what they were witnessing with everything they had assumed just minutes earlier. Sergeant Brooks looked down briefly, then back up, understanding now why his instincts had reacted before his training could explain it. Cole remained frozen, every instinct telling him to speak, to correct, to regain control, but none of them worked. None of them fit the moment anymore, because the structure had already changed, and he was no longer at the center of it. The colonel's attention never left Arthur. "We were not expecting you today," he continued, voice quieter now, but no less firm, and Arthur gave the smallest nod, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the jacket, as if acknowledging its presence rather than defending it. "Plans change," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach the ears that needed to hear it. Nothing more. The wind picked up again, lifting the fabric slightly, and this time no one laughed, no one commented. The jacket was no longer something to mock. It had become something else entirely, something that carried meaning no one dared question. Colonel Vance glanced briefly at the others, not fully turning, just enough to include them in what came next. "This area is secure," he said, the statement calm but final. And it was not a suggestion, it was a correction, a quiet reordering of the moment, a reminder of where authority now rested. Cole swallowed again, stepping back another inch without realizing it, the distance widening not just physically but in understanding. And then the colonel turned fully back to Arthur, lowering his voice just enough that it felt private even in the open air. "We should talk," he said, and Arthur held his gaze for a second longer before giving a slight nod, as if agreeing to something that had already been decided long before this moment began. And as they turned to walk, the soldiers around them parted without being told, the space opening naturally, silently, and behind them, the place where laughter had once filled the air remained completely still. The gravel crunched softly under their steps as Colonel Vance and Arthur Hayes moved away from the tarmac, the distance between them and the others growing with each measured stride. Yet the silence they left behind followed them like a shadow, heavy and unbroken, no one daring to speak until they were far enough that their voices would not carry back. Sergeant Brooks exhaled slowly, only now realizing he had been holding his breath, his eyes still fixed on the retreating figure of the old man. The jacket moving gently with each step, no longer just worn fabric, but something else entirely, something that had shifted the entire atmosphere of the base in less than a minute. Lieutenant Cole remained where he stood, posture rigid but no longer confident, his gaze lowered for the first time since the encounter began, replaying every word he had said, every gesture, the casual way he had dismissed a man he did not understand, and the weight of that realization settled in his chest with a quiet intensity that no command could remove. A younger soldier beside him leaned slightly closer, voice barely above a whisper. "Who is he?" But Brooks did not answer right away, his mind still piecing together fragments, the stitching, the symbol, the name, the way the colonel had reacted without hesitation, without question, as if the past had reached forward and demanded recognition. Finally he spoke, just as quietly. Someone you do not laugh at. And that was enough to stop any further questions across the base, beyond the line of sight of the tarmac. The air felt different, as if word had begun to travel without being spoken, doors opening, conversations pausing, a subtle ripple moving through the structure of command, not loud, not visible, but real, and inside a shaded corridor lined with concrete walls and framed unit insignias. Colonel Vance slowed his pace slightly, glancing toward Arthur, his voice lower now, more controlled. "We kept the records sealed," he said. The words careful, chosen, Arthur did not respond immediately, his gaze moving along the corridor as if measuring the distance between what had been and what remained. "You were not supposed to find me," he said finally, his tone calm, without accusation, without surprise, just a statement of fact. Vance gave a small nod, acknowledging it. "We did not," he replied. "You walked in." A faint pause followed, the kind that carries more meaning than explanation. Arthur's hand brushed lightly against the inside of the jacket again, fingers tracing the seam where the hidden stitching lay. And for a moment the present seemed thinner, as if something older pressed just beneath it, not breaking through, not fully revealed, but present, always present. Vance noticed the motion, his expression tightening slightly, not in discomfort but in recognition. "We thought it was gone," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. Arthur shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "Nothing like that ever goes away." The words settled between them. Not heavy, not dramatic, but final in a way that left no room for doubt. Behind them, far back on the tarmac, the soldiers had begun to move again, but differently now, slower, more aware, as if the space they occupied had changed shape. And Lieutenant Cole, still standing where it had all begun, lifted his eyes one last time toward the empty path where the old man had walked, the echo of that single moment lingering longer than anything he had ever been taught, because some lessons do not come from orders, and some respect is not given, it is remembered. The corridor lights hummed softly overhead as they continued forward, the steady rhythm of footsteps echoing against the concrete walls, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It carried history, unspoken and heavy. Colonel Vance slowed again as they reached a secured door, his hand hovering over the access panel for a brief moment before pressing it. The lock disengaging with a muted click, he stepped aside slightly, allowing Arthur to enter first, a gesture small but deliberate. And inside the room the air was cooler, controlled, the kind of space where decisions were made and records were kept out of sight. Vance closed the door behind them, the outside world cut off instantly, and for a moment neither man moved further, as if crossing that threshold required more than just a step. Arthur's eyes moved across the room, taking in the details without urgency. A table, a few chairs, a wall display of unit insignias, each one representing a story officially told, officially recorded, but his gaze did not linger on them. Instead it settled briefly on an empty section of the wall, a space where something could have been, but was not. Vance noticed. Of course he did. And his expression tightened just slightly. "We removed it years ago," he said, voice low, almost careful. Arthur gave a small nod, not surprised, not disappointed, just acknowledging what he already understood. "That is what you do," he replied, his tone even, not accusing, just factual. Vance exhaled slowly, moving toward the table but not sitting, his hands resting lightly on the surface as if grounding himself. "We did what we were told," he said, the words carrying a weight that suggested more than procedure. Arthur stepped closer, the faint sound of fabric shifting the only movement, his hand once again brushing the inside of the jacket, feeling the seam beneath his fingers, the hidden work that had never been meant to be seen. And for a moment the room seemed to narrow, the present giving way just enough for memory to press forward, not fully, not completely, just fragments. The low hum of rotors somewhere distant, the sharp crackle of a radio that never quite held a signal, voices speaking in tones that carried urgency without panic, and the steady awareness that what was being done would never be written down, would never be acknowledged beyond those who had been there. The memory did not overwhelm him. It never did. It simply existed alongside everything else, as constant as the breath in his chest. Vance watched him carefully, recognizing the shift even if he could not see it. "We thought you were gone," he said after a moment, quieter now. Arthur looked up, his eyes clear, present again. "You were supposed to," Vance added. And this time there was something in his voice, not doubt, not fear, but the weight of a truth that had been accepted for years without question. Arthur held his gaze, the faintest hint of something unreadable passing through his expression. "That was the plan," he said, simple, direct, and the words settled into the room with a finality that made explanation unnecessary. Outside, beyond the sealed door, the base continued to function. Orders given, tasks completed, but something had shifted beneath it all, subtle, unseen, and inside that quiet room, the past had stepped back into place, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a presence that could not be ignored, because some things are not erased, no matter how carefully they are hidden. The room remained still after the words settled, not tense, not uneasy, but quiet in a way that suggested something long buried had finally been acknowledged without needing to be explained. Colonel Vance moved slowly around the table, not breaking eye contact, as if the distance between them mattered less than the weight of what stood unspoken. "There were reports," he said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "Fragments. Nothing complete, just enough to raise questions that no one wanted to answer." Arthur Hayes listened without interrupting, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if he had heard versions of this before, in different rooms, from different men, all carrying the same uncertainty wrapped in different language. "You were never listed," Vance continued. "No official record, no discharge, no confirmation." He paused, the silence stretching just long enough to make the next words matter more. "Just absence." Arthur gave a slight nod, not agreeing, not correcting, simply acknowledging the description, because absence had always been the closest thing to truth anyone else was allowed to hold. His hand moved once more along the inside seam of the jacket, fingers tracing the line that separated what was seen from what was hidden, and this time he spoke, his voice low, measured. "We were not meant to be listed." The statement was simple, but it carried a clarity that cut through years of speculation. Vance exhaled slowly, stepping back slightly, as if absorbing it. "Then why come back?" he asked, not as an accusation, not even as a challenge, but as a genuine question, the kind that only comes when assumptions no longer hold. Arthur's gaze shifted briefly toward the empty section of the wall again, that space where something had once existed and then been removed, and for a moment the quiet hum of the room seemed to deepen. "Because something was left unfinished," he said, and the words did not rise, did not demand attention, but they landed with a weight that filled the space. Between them, Vance's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to show that the meaning had reached him. "Unfinished," he repeated, as if testing the word against everything he knew, everything he had been told to forget, and somewhere in the back of his mind, pieces began to align, small details that had never made sense on their own now forming a pattern he could no longer ignore. "We were told it ended," he said quietly. Arthur looked back at him, his eyes steady. "That is what they needed you to believe," he replied, not harsh, not critical, just direct, the truth presented without decoration. Outside the room the bass continued its rhythm, but inside, time seemed to move differently, slower, more deliberate, as if each second carried more weight than it should. Vance straightened slightly, the officer returning to the surface, but not replacing the man beneath it. "If something is unfinished," he said, his voice regaining its firmness, "then it becomes my responsibility." Now, Arthur held his gaze for a moment longer, measuring the statement, not questioning the authority behind it, but the understanding, the readiness, and then he gave a small nod, just enough to acknowledge it, because some responsibilities are not assigned, they are inherited, and the moment they are recognized, they cannot be set aside again. The room fell quiet once more, but this time it was different, not the quiet of uncertainty, but the quiet that comes when a path has been set, even if no one has yet taken the first step. Colonel Vance did not move right away, but something in his posture changed, subtle yet unmistakable, the shift from listening to deciding, from reacting to acting. And when he finally spoke again his voice carried a different edge, quieter but sharper. Then we do not leave it unfinished, he said, not as a suggestion, not as a question, but as a statement that settled into the room with authority. Arthur Hayes watched him closely, not with approval, not with doubt, but with the calm attention of someone who had seen this moment before in different forms, in different men, and knew that what came next would define everything that followed. Vance turned slightly, reaching toward the secure console embedded in the wall, his hand hovering for just a fraction of a second before entering a code that was not part of routine operations. The system responded instantly, a low tone confirming access to something deeper, something rarely touched, and a panel on the far side of the room flickered to life, the screen blank at first, then filling with lines of data that did not belong to any standard record, no unit designation, no official timeline, just fragments, coordinates without context, names reduced to initials, and dates that seemed to skip forward in uneven intervals, as if entire sections had been removed rather than redacted. Arthur's gaze shifted to the screen, not surprised, not impressed, just observing, because he recognized the pattern, even in its broken form. "You kept more than I expected," he said quietly, and Vance gave a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had not carried so much weight. "Not by choice," he replied, his eyes scanning the incomplete file. "Some things were too complex to erase completely." He paused, then added, "or too important." The word lingered, not fully defined, but understood. Arthur stepped closer to the display, the light reflecting faintly off the worn fabric of his jacket, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow again, the present and the past overlapping just enough to blur the line between them. A series of numbers caught his attention, coordinates that should not have meant anything anymore, but did, and his hand lifted slightly, not touching the screen, just hovering near it as if confirming what he already knew. "It started here," he said, almost to himself, and Vance followed his gaze, reading the data with a new awareness, the pieces aligning faster now, the gaps between them no longer random. "That location was cleared years ago," he said, but even as he spoke the certainty in his voice began to thin. Arthur lowered his hand slowly, his expression unchanged. "Cleared is not the same as finished," he replied, and the distinction settled heavily between them. Vance straightened, the full weight of command returning, but now grounded in something deeper than protocol. "If this is still active," he said, his voice firm again, "then we need to know why." Arthur turned his head slightly, meeting his eyes, and for the first time there was the faintest shift in his expression, not emotion, not urgency, but recognition, as if the question itself was the confirmation. "You already know why," he said, and the simplicity of it left no room for argument. Outside the room the bass continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the line that had just been crossed. But inside, the path forward had taken shape, not fully visible, not fully understood, but undeniable. And as the screen continued to glow with fragments of a past that refused to stay buried, Colonel Vance reached for the next command, knowing that whatever came next would not be written down, but would be remembered. The glow of the screen dimmed slightly as the system settled into standby, the fragments of data still visible, but no longer shifting, as if they had revealed just enough and nothing more. Colonel Vance lowered his hand from the console, the decision already made before any formal order could be given, and in the quiet that followed, the weight of what lay ahead became clear without needing to be spoken. Arthur Hayes stood beside him, unchanged, steady, the worn jacket resting against his frame, as it always had, but now it carried a presence that filled the room more than any rank or title ever could. Vance turned toward him fully, his voice measured, controlled, but grounded in something deeper than protocol. "We will move on this quietly," he said, not asking for agreement, but offering a path forward. Arthur gave a slight nod, the kind that acknowledged understanding rather than approval, because some paths do not belong to one man alone. They belong to the history that created them, and the responsibility that follows. Outside the sealed room the bass continued its routine, unaware that a line had just been crossed, unaware that something long considered finished had begun again in silence. Vance reached for a secure handset, his movements precise, efficient, issuing instructions that did not carry names or details, only direction, only intent. And as the orders moved outward through channels that rarely saw use, a small circle of individuals began to shift into motion, each one unaware of the full picture, but aware enough to understand that this was not routine, not standard, not something to question. Arthur stepped back slightly, giving the colonel space, his eyes moving once more to the empty section of the wall, the place where something had once been displayed and then erased, and for a brief moment the silence returned. Not heavy, not uncertain, but complete, as if acknowledging that what had been hidden was no longer fully buried. Vance finished speaking and set the handset down, turning back with a steadiness that had replaced the earlier hesitation. "We will need you," he said, the words simple, direct, carrying no decoration. Arthur met his gaze, and for the first time there was the faintest hint of something deeper in his expression. Not reluctance, not eagerness, but recognition of what those words truly meant. "You always did," he replied, and the answer carried more history than explanation, more truth than any record could hold. Vance nodded once, accepting it, because some